Well, good afternoon. Good Martin Luther King Day as well to everyone. So Alan Ewing here, Executive Director of the OnGo Alliance. If you have been with us on many of our virtual meetings, this is not the usual background you've come to associate with me. I'm actually visiting some family in central Kentucky, and we were lucky enough last night to get about 6 inches of snow. So adding to the complexity of the whole situation. But regardless, we're able to meet virtually effectively, and looking forward to bringing you today's session that we have developed and is known as OnGo Insights. Uh, Today, I have some really interesting program for you. Share some insights, literally, from folks about the ecosystem and the way it's developing, and also about spectrum and internationalization of spectrum sharing. So with that, if we can go ahead and move into the next slide. Uh, so one thing we would ask of everyone, if you do have questions during the webinar, please use the questions function. You'll see a panel over on your right, I believe, at least for me, it's on my right, where you'll be able to submit questions. We will attempt to answer your questions live as time allows, but we will definitely take note of all your questions, and if we can't do them live, we will certainly do them after the fact. We'll make all that available as well. Next slide, one of our usual questions, and one I'm sure we'll hear as we go along here, is will these be available? Most certainly the slides and the recordings will be available to all the members and posted in Causeway within 1 week of the meeting. It takes a little time for us to turn it into that collateral and get it up on the site for everyone to take advantage of. So you'll be able to share that with colleagues, et cetera, that weren't able to join us today. So go on to the next slide. So just a quick overview of the agenda again. This is my welcome and introduction. I'll give you a little bit of information about the Alliance again. Some of you are more new than others. Some of you we've had a chance to chat, others not yet. So we always try to level set at the beginning of these sessions and just go over things that to help make sure everyone is aware of a little bit of our history and a little bit about where we are. We're very fortunate. We're very fortunate when it comes to having some information about the Spectrum Pipeline update today. We have some folks with us, Dave Wright, who is our president, Mark Gibson, and Andy Clegg, all very knowledgeable in this area, and will share their information with you regarding where we are with potential spectrum for sharing, as well as from an international perspective. And then our third part of today, we'll have a panel of industry folks. We used to do a SaaS panel where we had the SaaS admins come in and tell us a little bit about what's going on, but it's really time to expand beyond that now. So what we've decided to term this is our ecosystem panel, and it we'll delve back into the SaaS and some of the developments that are occurring there, but we'll extend beyond that. So we'll talk about the technologies that are rolling down the pipe here towards us with 5G, some of the ecosystem enhancements when it comes to things like neutral host, et cetera. And talk about real deployments. We'll talk about the things that we're learning as this is becoming reality and is reality. Next slide. So a little bit of that overview of that history very quickly for you. Again, this is review for many of you. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Is, of course, the OnGo Alliance Industry Association, created to really champion the 3GPP-based technologies inside of shared spectrum. In particular, when it was formed, the CBRS spectrum. At the beginning of January 2021, we enhanced our mission to include additional bands and additional geographies beyond just the CBRS band. So that was the reason for the transition to the OnGo Alliance name. If you're interested in some of what was specified to make CBRS, the term you'll hear kicked around is Part 96, of course. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are very familiar with that. And in Part 96, everything is defined as to how to make this CBRS spectrum shared. So feel free to check that out. Again, I would assume most, if not all of you, are very well versed in that, but just to make sure we're level set. On the next slide, have a little bit of our history. And going back to 2010, when NTIA really identified the spectrum that we are operating in for potential shared use. Moving through all of that and all the things that have happened, what we've really seen beginning in 2020 was full commercial service, the PAL auction, which were watershed moments for the deployment of shared spectrum in the CBRS band, and then our transition into the OnGo Alliance at the beginning of 2021. And over 2021, in spite of the, and 2020 as well, in spite of the pandemic, and everyone is sick and tired of hearing about COVID and talking about COVID and not being able to meet because of COVID. But in spite of that, those challenges, the Alliance and the deployments have really grown and developed very nicely and helped to fulfill the promise of what shared spectrum is all about. While never underestimate the negative impacts of the pandemic, the human cost, et cetera. But from a technology perspective, this has been the perfect opportunity for shared spectrum to be utilized to help in spite of the difficulties. So things with education, medical, et cetera, is really shown and has been very timely as well. And then what we've seen over 2021 is the continued growth of the Alliance, and also underpinning that and why we're growing as an Alliance, frankly, is that commercial deployments are growing. So that continues to be something we monitor and discuss, and making sure that the real promise of the spectrum is kept. We go on to the next slide. So the Alliance itself really has 4 missions. When you boil it down: specification development. This is, again, building on our 3GPP specs that come from ETSI. We do not supersede any of those, but instead support them to make sure that, again, where shared spectrum comes into play, how do we make sure to get the most out of the spectrum? The certification program, again, this is really about interoperability of features, specifically when it comes to spectrum sharing. Our advocacy program, which you're going to hear a little bit about here in a few moments tangentially, where we maintain close relationships with the various regulatory bodies. And that is to have that conversation so that when any issues come up or opportunities arise, we are in the best position to take advantage of those and help solve them. And then finally, and really been the most challenging in light of the fact we haven't been able to gather in person, is this concept of community building. We have an incredible forum here, collaborative forum. The experts, the companies, all of the knowledge and all of the drive that make this real are here. And so, I would encourage our members that may not interact as much with the working groups, et cetera. This is an opportunity to really take advantage of a community that is there to help you make the most out of the opportunity. So there's a lot of shared experiences, shared stories, information, opportunities to put yourself forward as a company. All of that is on the table, and really what the Alliance is here for, to support you. So please, if you have any questions or thoughts about how I can take advantage of my membership, reach out to myself, to Oren, to the board, to the chairs of the working groups. We're here to help bring this to reality and make it the best experience possible. Next slide. So just very quickly on the organization, again, if you're part of us, there are 5 primary working groups. On the right, our technical working group and test and certification working group. They're here to help develop the specs, turn them into a cert program. On the left side, our business and deployment operations working groups. They're here to help develop the ecosystem and develop the the understanding of the ecosystem to make sure the specs and the cert programs we develop are meaningful and on point, among other things. And then in the middle, really, and kind of the glue in a way that holds us together, the marketing effort, making sure that we're communicating effectively outward, inward, as well as participating in the right kind of events. So a lot of work going on in the marketing working group as well. Next slide. 195 members. This is the current count. We are currently in the renewal process for many of you. So those that have already submitted your memberships for 2022, thank you. If you need any help along those lines, let us know. We have had a few members from 2021 not continue their membership, but already we've added several more, and we're talking to even more companies about joining this community of information sharing. So really, it's very gratifying to me personally that this is the group, that these companies want to come together and talk. And I try to talk to all of you as members. Anytime I am available for discussions or to help you out. But I really look forward and really enjoy the opportunity to chat with our members. So never hesitate. And I will be reaching out yet again, many different ways to have conversations with you and your companies, your leadership, whomever. Very good. And next slide, and I believe, oh, I'm sorry, the 5G story. Yes, very important. 5G is on everyone's mind. One of the things that we occasionally hear is, there seems to be this bit of misunderstanding or just outright incorrect information regarding 5G support in CBRS. We are certainly a 5G enabled band, and we are seeing equipment, devices, we are seeing CBSDs, and our certification program is addressing this as well. You'll see in the device ecosystem, we maintain a listing on the webpage, and we're working on making that even more robust now. But that number of devices grows all the time. So please, take a look at that listing on our public web pages, and it will show you. We have a switch on there now that you can click and see if just the specific devices that are supporting 5G in band 48 or N48, of course. Next slide. And we'll talk more about deployments in 5G in our session at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave and Andy and Mark to take us through a Spectrum pipeline update. So gentlemen, I'm going to go off video and turn it over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Alan, for the intro. Happy New Year. Happy 2022, everyone. I see Andy. I'm assuming Mark is going to be joining us here momentarily.
Yeah, my webcam is not coming up, so not sure what that's all. Oh, there it is. There we go. What the heck is going on there?
No attention to the man behind the curtain. At least we have his voice. So, yeah. So we're going to just have a little bit of a kind of update for you on what's going on, with Spectrum, particularly with a U.S. focus, but also a bit of an international. We're going to do this as somewhat of a roundtable. So, one of us will introduce a topic, and then the other folks will just jump in to add any color or fill in any gaps. So maybe we'll just do a quick round of intros. For those who don't know me, I'm Dave Wright. I am the president of the Alliance. My day job is with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, where I head up global wireless policy. Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Gibson, and I am the regulatory officer on the panel for the Alliance, and I work with CommScope.
Yep, and I'm Andy Clegg, and I'm sort of an emergency backup board member for the OnGo Alliance, and my day job is Spectrum Engineering Lead at Google.
Great, thanks. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I think the first thing we're just going to quickly talk about is, what's going on in DC with, with the leadership of the agencies that oversee Spectrum in our country. So, as you know, the commission, that is the Federal Communications Commission, has oversight for commercial spectrum uses, and then NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, has oversight of federally allocated spectrum. And we've been waiting for some time for some leadership updates here. Obviously since the last presidential elections and then President Biden's inauguration last January, there's been a lot of speculation about when he would name a permanent FCC chair. We'd had Commissioner Rosenworcel serving as the acting chairperson since that time, but the good news from my perspective is that in a relatively bipartisan manner, with broad support, Jessica Rosenworcel was confirmed. She was, the way the process works is there's the Commerce Committee of the Senate has they're the committee with oversight of the FCC. So they're the ones at the committee level who have to put forward, they have to confirm nominees at the committee level, and then it goes to the full Senate for a floor vote. The floor vote occurred December 7th. Jessica got, again, I think it was 68 to 31 or something along those lines in terms of the support that she got from the full Senate. So she has now been confirmed and voted as the not only an FCC commissioner, but the FCC permanent chair, and that'll be through 2026. So that's good. The Democratic Party is obviously the majority party in the country at the moment. So the way that works at the FCC is they get 3 commissioners, and then the minority party, the Republicans, have 2 nominees or 2 commissioners on the commission. So as of today, with Chairwoman Rosenworcel's reconfirmation, we've got a 2-2 commission. So we have 2 Democrats, Chairwoman Rosenworcel and Commissioner Starks, and then we have 2 Republicans, Commissioner Carr and oh my goodness, I am so blanking. I need help here, Mark and Andy. Sorry? Symington, thank you. I knew that, I just couldn't remember it.
Yeah.
So we have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The Biden administration has nominated a woman by the name of Gigi Son as the 3rd Democratic commissioner. It's caught up in some controversy. There's a few senators, particularly on the Republican side, who've particularly called out some of her historical stances on issues and raised some concerns, objections. People have talked about potentially going so far as to try to block a confirmation vote on the full Senate if it gets to that point. So we'll see how that all plays out. We do have some advocacy groups advising us out of DC on some issues, and their sense is that Ms. Son will eventually be confirmed, but it may take some time, as in it could be the summer timeframe before we get a 3rd commissioner. So in the short term, my sense is that means that Chairwoman Rosenworcel has got at least she said the ambiguity around her personal situation settled, so that's going to give her some confidence. But with a 2-2 commission, she's probably not really in a position to take on anything overly controversial in terms of new proceedings or new reports in order, things like this. So anything that could be lumped into the controversial category would probably have to wait to the second half of the year, is at least my view. Mark and Andy, I'm going to pause there just to see if you guys have anything to add on the commission.
One thing I would add is that by virtue of the commissioners being sort of not fully filled out, the people in key bureau positions that we would want to be dealing with, bureau chiefs, are not also filled out. They're actually acting right now. So we deal primarily with the folks in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and the guy that's running that is Joel Taubenblatt. He's acting. And then the guy running the OET, Office of Engineering and Technology, is Ron Rapazzi, and Ron is acting. And what that means just in general is that when people are in acting roles, generally in the government, they're loath to do anything undertake any new initiatives. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do as the Alliance, working with the regulators, both the Commission and the NTIA, has kind of been just sort of moving along in very, very slow fashion, waiting for these people to get filled out. So that's the only thing I'd add.
Andy?
Yeah, nothing from my end. I was going to say the same thing Mark was, but also, one thing is that the Commission and NTIA, which Dave is going to talk about next, are also preoccupied with a lot of major issues at the moment that don't involve CBRS. And so that impacts a little bit of the attention we can get on CBRS, which can be a good thing, frankly. But anyway, there's a lot of big issues they're dealing with right now.
Yeah, indeed. So I think we're going to touch on those a little bit later. So with NTIA, again, this is the agency that oversees federal spectrum, and we haven't had a permanent NTIA administrator in like over 2 years. So we've had acting representation there for quite some time, and that's been fine. But I think, for a lot of our issues in CBRS, where we are, directly straddling the line between commercial and federal spectrum with our band, with the military and Navy in particular being, the primary incumbent operations, and certainly, very influential in terms of the policy making and the administration of the band. Having strong NTIA leadership is important. And so Alan Davidson, who's got a long history in DC, was named as the NTIA administrator and an undersecretary of commerce, confirmed again by the full Senate. January 11th, again, a pretty good bipartisan showing of support for Alan. NTIA has a lot on its plate right now. Along with the Commission, they're being tapped to distribute a lot of federal funding for various initiatives, whether it's some of the funding in support of Open RAN development, as well as some of the infrastructure spending around broadband, supply chain security issues. All of that is sort of falling on NTIA. And so having somebody there who can help, not only oversee the spectrum management aspects of things, but some of these other federal initiatives at the moment, I think was certainly on Congress's mind, as well as the president's, when they named Alan. So, I think he's going to be leaning pretty heavily on the Office of Spectrum Management, which is one of the departments, if you will, within NTIA. And we've got good relationships with most of the OSM leadership. Charles Cooper, who's appeared at different Alliance events many times, Derek Loppin, Ed Drusella on the engineering side, a number of other folks there that we have good relationships with. And my expectation is that Alan is going to lean pretty heavily on those people for the spectrum matters. It's not really directly what he's dealt with in the past, but in any event, I think having him in there as the not an acting, but as the permanent, if you will, NTIA administrator is going to be very beneficial to us. Again, he was just confirmed last week. We want to give him a little bit of time to get his feet underneath him, but we'd like to get in and meet with him and OSM leadership in the February timeframe is what we talked about. So again, Mark, Andy.
Andy, you go first.
No, nothing more to add on my end.
I guess the only thing I'd add is two things. One is, one of the reasons that Davidson was brought on board is he's a really good administrator. And NTIA has to administer at least $48 billion worth of the funding. There's many fundings there. And so he's going to be really busy with that. So as Dave said, having him there sort of is going to enable the people under him. And we've been waiting for him to get there so we can really get active in some of the other initiatives we have with him. And the other thing I was going to say, I forgot. So it's just one thing. So anyhow, keep going.
Circle back to it. As Andy alluded to, and I think, again, we're going to touch on this a little bit, there are some pretty high priority things, and any of you who follow, the spectrum and technology press, particularly with the DC angle, are well aware of some of the public, kerfuffles that are going on at the moment. what I would say is, that is taking up an inordinate amount. I mean, like the majority of the time of a lot of the OET personnel, so the Office of Engineering and Technology, as well as the NTIA folks. Again, you got, the FCC on one side of that, trying to get the spectrum opened up, and then NTIA and the FAA on the other side. So, okay. With that, let's move along. I think, Mark, you got the next slide. So
okay, if you want to go to the next slide, there we go. So here is the pipeline in the bands that we're thinking about right now. So one might ask, well, is 3 gigahertz the only pipeline band that we're interested in? And the answer is yes. There's certainly other bands out there that are being considered, the 12 gig band, the 4.9 gig band. There's work even still going on in the 6 gig band. There's the 70 to 90 gig band. But from the sweet spot of where 5G is right now, this is the bands 3100 to 30, I'd say the 3980, which is the upper end of the Cedar or 3.7 gig band. So I thought I'd put this slide together that kind of captures the activities in the entire portion of the band. And it's interesting, the way the bands have been allocated is from basically the middle out, maybe middle going up. So what I'll do is I'll start from the left and go to the right, just because that's the way we read. So one of the reasons I put the 2900 portion of the band is for people to get a sense as to what's in there, because a fair amount of what is in the 3100 to 3450 meg band, which is just currently going to be under study, to the extent anything gets relocated, a lot of that stuff can operate down to 2900, and so it might end up getting relocated down there. So that's one of the reasons I started at 2900. Another thing, if you just look at the diagram at the top, anybody that follows ITU or the table of allocations really closely, this should look pretty familiar. You'll notice that above 3300 megahertz, there's nothing that's secondary, which is I sort of a weird artifact I realized when I was putting this together. All of the allocations, to the extent that there are allocations, are primary, and you know that from the colors, not from capitalization, which is the way it would look like if it were an ITU or the commission. And the other thing is that a lot of allocations in the non-federal portions of the band, federal portions of the band have been moved, as well as the non-federal. There was an amateur allocation above 3,300 that was removed in that rulemaking. So much to the chagrin of the amateurs, and Andy and I are among that ilk. So just some things to focus in on. The other thing too is this comes out of a diagram I put together to compare allocations from 10 years ago to today. And it's actually worth noting that across 3100 to 4000, which is the upper end of the 3.7 gig band, there are now 650 megahertz of spectrum for mobile, where before there were only 50. So, the commission and the NTIA have been very busy in 10 years, which is really light speed for regulators, making more spectrum available. So again, starting at 3100 to 3450, we'll just go straight across. And like I said, Dave and Andy can add commentary, as they can. So as I said, the 3100 to 3450 meg band is really the next band under study. That's currently allocated to radio location, which is basically a fancy word for radars. And then there's the Earth Exploration Satellite and Space Research, which are passive services. Well, EESS, Earth Exploration Satellite, is passive. Space research is not necessarily passive. And then there's a lot of DoD stuff in those portions of the band. So what's going to happen is the National Spectrum Consortium, which, if you don't know the National Spectrum Consortium, or the NSC was stood up after AWS 3 happened, to facilitate the interaction of the commercial and federal users, commercial and federal spectrum users, to try to make it easier to innovate on new ways to share. And so the powers that be thought that study of sharing this band would make sense if we parked it under the National Spectrum Consortium. So the NSC is right now working on ways to facilitate the sharing of classified information with the commercial users through the process set up in the National Spectrum Consortium. Actually, that's happening as we speak, actually. So one way or another, that will be studied. And another thing to look at in that band, that band was mentioned in some of the spectrum proceedings, the broadband proceedings. The auction in that band won't occur any sooner than November 2025. That's actually in the bill. So we've got a fair amount of time to study whether to share, how to share, whether to relocate, how to relocate, and all of that. And to some minor extent, some of the things that were in the bands that we're looking at, 3450 to 3550, and then the CBRS bands were relocated in this band. So some of that stuff is going to have to be moved again. I won't get into the details and some of the nuances of will the auction make the minimum, because nobody really knows that, because it's very early on. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of work that's going to be done there. So I'll stop and see if Dave and Andy have any comments on the 3100 to 3450 so far.
So I would just add, one of the reasons why our regulators are so interested in finding mobile spectrum in this band, including CBRS, is that this band is sort of unique in the United States with all its radar incumbency, with our military using all this radar and stuff. In a lot of other countries, they don't have all of this radar incumbency, and they've been able to allocate this band for 5G services and things like that. And those countries are starting to adopt it. I mean, it's part of Band 77 and all sorts of other 3GPP recognized bands. In the US is just trying to catch up from a 5G perspective, and they believe that because this is allocated to mobile services in other countries, they should find ways to allocate it here. It's just that we have all of this DoD incumbency with radars that we're having to work around, so it complicates the deployments here. But so far, they're doing a good job of finding ways to share the spectrum. But as Mark alluded to, the farther down the band we go, the more compressed existing radar activity has been pushed, and it's going to get harder and harder to share. You notice it's challenging to share some parts of CBRS. It's perhaps even more challenging to share some parts of the 3.45 gigahertz service. And I think it's going to be even more challenging to share parts of the 3.1 to 3.45, although, we'll see. If they generate tons of money in the auction, maybe DoD systems can be relocated, but I suspect we're going to be under some kind of sharing environment there. But that's the reason why there's all this effort in finding 3 gigahertz spectrum for mobile systems, is because the rest of the world is using this band, and we want to try to harmonize to some extent.
All right, thanks. Any comments, Dave?
The only point I would make is I think this slide, the introduction that you did, Mark, on sort of the overall 3 gigahertz band, and it's pretty obvious just looking at this that federal and non-federal are going to be in play for the foreseeable future. So I think it underscores the previous slide that we need to have close relationships with both the Commission, but also with NTIA, because we're likely going to be dealing with them as well. That's it.
Okay, great, thanks. One thing I did neglect to mention that Andy talked about is there's more discussion of sharing in this portion of the band than there was in the 345 gig. Whether it stays that way or not, it's hard to tell. $50 million has been allocated to study that, so we'll see what happens there. So, and I'm working in that, I reckon Andy as well. Moving up then into 345, there was some recent news in that band. That auction occurred in 2 phases. There was the clock phase, which concluded on November 16th. That's the one where you sort of say what spectrum you want to bid on, and then, or just generally what markings and what spectrum. And then the assignment phase comes on, and that ended January 4th. And the winners were just published. And so that generated ultimately over $22 billion, almost $22.5 billion, which is interesting because many were wondering whether that auction would meet its reserve, which was $14 billion, just because of a lot of the federal DoD systems in there. And there were 33 winners. The top winners were AT&T and Dish, and I forget the number 3, but Dish won a lot. AT&T spent the most. But that's interesting. I've got a slide after this that talks about some of these interstitial complications between 345 and 37 for CBRS. But now we'll know who we'll be dealing with. The interesting thing about the 345 gig band is that there are large swaths of the country that will be under encumbrances in terms of how you would share and how to deploy. These are called CPAs, or coordinated protection areas. And underlying those coordinated protection areas are something called periodic use areas. And the Commission has a public notice on that and talks about how that's going to work and whatnot. Some of these are huge. There's a huge one in the middle of the country that's over the entire state of Arkansas. A lot of them on the East Coast. And so there's a lot of sharing that's going to happen there, but the sharing is going to be more or less command and control coordination, kind of like where people that want to deploy in there will submit deployment information through a portal to the DoD. The DoD will run analyses. They'll send the analysis results back to the person that sent them through that same portal, and then they'll have at it. And the longest relocation time in that band is up to 11.5 years. So this presages probably what we'll be dealing with in 3100 to 3450 in terms of the complexities of sharing and whatnot. Nonetheless, given all those complexities, people spend over $22 billion. So there still is a thirst for spectrum. Andy, Dave, any additional comments?
The third and fourth biggest bidders were T-Mobile and an entity known as 345 Spectrum.
Worth noting, a guy got a market for $1,500. So
yeah.
Good man.
I think you've covered the salient points.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And then the band we know and love, the CBRS band, just generally what's going on there. PPAs or PALs are being deployed now. PAL protection areas are being declared. Fair amount of that going on, thousands of that actually happening. So, and that sort of opened up toward the end of the year last year in earnest. So we're seeing a lot of activity there. Deployments are approaching 190K. It's probably actually over 190K. That was the latest figure that we had seen released, but I think they're over that right now in terms of the number of CBSDs deployed. The vast majority, almost 99% of those deployments are outdoor, and that's mostly because most of us are working from home still due to COVID, so not a lot of us are in our office buildings, and so the indoor deployment model has sort of been waiting until we come out of COVID. Although there's about 2,400 of these devices that have been deployed, give or take, indoors, so the indoor deployment model is still happening. Whisper zone issues, these are the issues around the protection zones around ESCs. We call them whisper zones because it means they're not necessarily protections or exclusion zones. They're zones where you have to turn the power down, so that's whispering. And then there's adjacent band coordination, which I'll deal with in the next slide. So Dave, Andy, anything to add to that?
The only thing I would add is that we're working with the FCC to implement a leasing, spectrum leasing, PAL spectrum leasing capability in the spectrum access systems. We've been working with the FCC for quite some time on that. The holdup is not us. The FCC is, they're like many things, they've got a lot of things on their plate. It's going a little slower in them deploying the systems they need to support that. But we have undergone one round of testing and some feedback from the FCC. We're soon to do another round of testing on that. We're hoping that, perhaps later this quarter, that will go live, and it will just make it easier to lease spectrum. They call it light touch leasing, but it'll make it easier for PAL spectrum holders to lease their spectrum, and people who want to lease spectrum from PAL holders should make it easier for them to lease spectrum. But we're, again, the details and when that will be deployed is TBD, and that TBD is by the FCC.
Anything to add, Dave?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, just sort of by way of, reminder, if you will, and Alan, had that timeline chart that kind of showed, where we came from and what we've accomplished. Here we are in January, and there was a number of sort of spectrum, high-profile spectrum events in the fall, back to the October timeframe. We had NTI Spectrum Symposium, we had the America Spectrum Management Conference. And one of the things that continues to stand out to me, and I don't want us to lose sight of it, is, anytime you hear Chairwoman Rosenworcel speak, or Charles Cooper from NTIA, or Fred Moorfield from DoD speak on spectrum, everybody, all those people in senior government leadership positions holds up CBRS as a shining example of, how to do things right. This is we are seen as the example of federal commercial collaboration to open up a spectrum band. So yeah, I just want to remind everybody of that. We tend to focus on the challenges, and that's good. We need to address the challenges. But I just want to remind everybody that what we have accomplished to date already is groundbreaking. We have set a lot of new precedent in the band. We will continue to do that. And so as we start the year, let's also remember what we've accomplished.
Yeah, good points. Thanks, Dave. And then last but not least, the 3.7 gig band. Those that have been following that closely know a couple things. One is that deployment was supposed to start on January 5th. The primary carriers have been spent about a year to relocate earth stations out of the lower 100 megahertz in the top 46 partial economic areas. And so that went along swimmingly. But then they encountered the issue with radar altimeters. That this is what Andy and Dave and I have been alluding to, that has taken a lot of the focus from the regulators trying to solve that issue. And so now they're delayed until 2 days from now. Was that Wednesday? AT&T and Verizon can start deploying in the top 100, top 46 PEAs. I want to say categorically, in case anybody is asking or thinking whether CBRS poses any issue, and absolutely not. If you just look at the spectrum there, this radar altimeters operate in the middle of the 4200 to 4400 band. You don't see that, but they do. And so that's a frequency separation for just the upper end of CBRS of over 600 megahertz. So we're absolutely positive that there's no issue with CBRS interfering with radar altimeters. So we're not getting caught up in that, other than there have been references to CBRS in some of the filings, mostly just to say that if there were interference issues to the extent that have been alleged by the radar aviation community, CBRS would be causing a problem as well, and it's not. So, so if anybody has any questions about that, just please let us know. But I wanted to say that just, because it's sort of out there, and I wanted to make a categorical statement that that's not a problem. Otherwise, like I said, AT&T and Verizon and the other winners of the A block will start deploying in a couple days. They have mitigations that they have to undertake that will be in place for 6 months for a certain set of airports, and then after that, things should be fine. So that's it for the 3.7 gig service. And again, the rest of the country then can start get deployed around December 2023. That's everything outside of the top 46 PEAs. Dave, Andy, anything to add?
Nope.
The only thing I'd add, for those of you who've been following, I probably already know this already, but anybody who may not have delved into the weeds on this, as Mark said, this lower 100 megahertz, that's being made available now. Ultimately, I think Verizon's going to get it in almost every market, but for this interim phase until this December 23 period, they split it between Verizon and AT&T as the two top winning bidders, and then in 23 they go to a final assignments phase, and they kind of reshuffle the blocks and to make them more contiguous. But yeah, that's a detail. It's all in the report if you want to go and look at it.
Okay, all right. Now we'll go to the next slide, and this kind of talks about what a 3.45 gig service. Oh no, actually it talks about the power situation. Andy, you have a really good way of explaining this, and since this is your slide, I'll give it to you to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, another way to look at the issue with regard to, the 3 gigahertz band in totality is the way that CBRS is sandwiched between the 3.45 gigahertz service, which was recently auctioned, and the 3.7 gigahertz service, which was auctioned a couple of years ago and is getting ready to deploy in a few days, as Mark mentioned. But the technical rules of the three services are actually very different. So the plot shows the amount of bandwidth allocated to the three different services. That's the size of the x-axis there. And the vertical height of the bars shows the maximum amount of EIRP, or transmit power, including antenna gain, that the services are allowed. So both the 3.45 and the 3.7 gigahertz service operate under pretty much the same technical rules. They're allowed to transmit up to 3,280 watts per megahertz. So it's very high power service. CBRS, on the other hand, the highest power you're allowed, EIRP, is 5 watts per megahertz, and that would be for a category B device. So this plot shows by scale, in scale, the relative amount of power allowed for the three services. So the blue is the 3.7, the red is the 3.45, and the green is CBRS. And maybe you say, what green? The green is the tiny little 1 pixel high bar down there at the bottom of the arrow it's pointing to. So CBRS compared to these others two is much lower power, and and again, this goes back to the FAA thing, much less of a threat to anything compared to the 3.7 gigahertz service. But as Mark alluded to earlier, there could, in theory, be some challenges with regard to edge coexistence between CBRS and 3.7 on the upper end and CBRS and 3.45 on the lower end. But OnGo Alliance has been into the FCC and other places advocating for consideration for protection of CBRS or coexistence at the boundaries. We've made some headway there, and I think everybody in the band realizes that we all need to protect each other. So, but it is a challenge going forward. We're going to keep our eye on it. We're going to hold the FCC to the promises they made with regard to considering interference and coexistence among the different services. And there's various technical committees, both within OnGo Alliance, but also independent technical committees, and within Wireless Innovation Forum that are looking at this. But we're certainly going to keep an eye on this and make sure there's not any undue interference to the CBRS band.
Anything to add, Dave?
I think the only thing I would add is, I think Mark alluded to the fact that we don't have 3100 to 3450 shown on this slide, but Mark mentioned that at this point, a lot of the talk has been around sharing, which sort of implies maybe lower power for the commercial systems. This is all TBD, so this is all speculation. But if you were to assume that we get an outcome more like CBRS as opposed to the 3.45 or the 3.7 service that you see represented here, that would mean we would then have sort of this low power sharing, high power, low power sharing, high power outcome, right? Which is probably not optimal in terms of the band adjacency issues that Andy just alluded to. So, for those of you who may be interested, I was just going to mention, one of the guys who was at the FCC is sort of one of the grandfathers of CBRS, is a guy named John Leibovitz. He and a woman who used to also be at the FCC in the WTB, Ruth Milkman, wrote a paper that came out in, I think, the September timeframe, talking about spectrum sharing policy. And then they did an analysis around this 3 gigahertz band, sort of the big picture 3 gigahertz that Mark led off with. And they talked about, it would have been better probably if initially people had thought about the overall outcomes here and maybe tried to group like services with like services and then kind of, make it a nice, linear type progression from low power to high power. So it's worth looking at that paper if you're interested in the policy,
That's a good point, Dave. And the only other thing I would add to this is that there have been a couple of proposals, actually, I think they're waiver requests, which is interesting in that rulemaking request, they're waiver requests, asking the commission to consider allowing higher power. Setting up 2 new categories of devices, a Cat C and a Cat D. The Cat C then would have 158 watts per megahertz, and the Cat D 1585 watts per megahertz. We'll have to see whether that happens. Those requests have been out now for over a year. I just wanted to mention that in case anybody's thinking about it. That was put out there by Dish, put an initial request, but there's a few that supported it. So that's out there, and what it tends to do is at least put the CBRS band a little on par with its higher power neighbors. The 1585 watts per megahertz is the power allowed in urban areas for both this maximum power allowed in urban areas for both the bands on either side of it. So that's just one thing that we're trying to do. These powers you see are the powers that are allowed in non-urban areas, so the maximum power. And again, that's the most part of the country. Okay, can we go to the next slide? I believe this slide talks about the band, adjacent band issues. Yes. So by virtue of the fact that we have, you see from the previous slide, we have this sort of great big power discontinuity between the 345 CBRS and 3.7 gig service, and the fact that CBRS is kind of in the middle. That brings up these band edge issues, which always exist. They're a little more unique here because of the advent of the SAS, and just the fact that, in my opinion, and this is sort of me opinionating, the CBRS band is called the innovation band. So starting at the bottom, actually starting at the top, which is where it began first, in the 3.7 gig service, when that service was being contemplated and the rules were out, the commission established 4 working groups to deal with these band issues. One actually dealt with the radar altimeter, there were two issues. One issue to deal with the coexistence between CBRS and 3.7 gig, and that was this technical working group 4. So the technical working group met and tried to propose a coordination regime. In the report that you see, that, well, actually, we tried to propose it, and it wasn't accepted. So right now, and the other thing we were trying to mitigate was really two things. One is all these bands across this 3450 to 3980 are TDD. So if the TDD is not synchronized with JSON operation, then you get frame clashes. And there's several different TDD configurations that can be used. Some are more shareable than others. So we were trying to come up with a mechanism or a protocol to facilitate that frame synchronization among carriers, both on the CBRS side and the 3.7 gig side. And the CBRS stuff up there is all GAA. And frankly, the concern that we heard from that was, well, GAA is sort of pseudo unlicensed, and so it doesn't have standing. Those are one of the arguments that were made. We tried to counter that by saying, no, it's not. But that didn't really work, and we tried to throw a lot of other arguments in there, and nonetheless, the report really came to no conclusion on how to coordinate frame sync, or for that matter, RF coordination. So the coordination processes are to be determined, and we'll see. There was some discussion in the Commission's rulemaking about whether the SASs could play a role, and so we'll have to see. That's still TBD. Going down to the band below 345, some of the same stuff exists. We have frame sync considerations. We also have RF coordination considerations. However, we have the additional issue with radar, the ESC whisper zones. And to that end, Andy and I, mostly Andy, worked on a paper on how we can coordinate. And what you see there is a coordination with CBRS operators. That paper, our WinForm RC 1016, sets up a coordination framework, a suggested framework on how we might coordinate and protect ESCs from interference. Because, you know, if we have to protect ESCs from interference from CBRS at maximum 50 watts, it's going to be worse from 345 gig service, maximum 3,480 watts per megahertz, or 62 kilowatts for base station in rural areas, even though they're adjacent. So we put together this protocol. It doesn't necessarily get into a coordination paradigm per se, but it does suggest methods for coexistence. But the bottom line coordination processes are to be determined. The other thing I would say that when the Alliance worked really hard with the Commission to try to get them to establish a coordination framework in the 345 gig service, if not for CBSDs, certainly for ESCs, because of the susceptibility to interference, and the desensitizing of an ESC to interference means that it basically is not really useful for sensing. What the Commission said in the rulemaking was that they would treat interference into an ESC as an equivalent to interference into a primary service. So we have that going for us going into this, and trying again to come up with a coordination process. So now that we know who the auction winners are, we'll engage with them. Many of them are Alliance members anyhow. So we're hopeful that we can either within the OnGo Alliance and or in the WinForum come up with a coordination process that's workable. Dave, Andy, anything to add on this?
No, but you know, the impact of adjacent bands onto ESC sensors is another reason OnGo Alliance has been a proponent of moving to informing incumbent capability, where instead of sensing DoD activity, they inform us through a portal. And honestly, we've made good headway there. They are moving in that direction, but in typical government and especially DoD fashion, it's going to take a long time, but they are moving in that direction. And I think when that happens, it'll be a great development.
Yeah, I forgot about the IIC. That's another, that goes back to all the work we're doing with the NTIA. Yep. Dave?
Nothing really to add, no.
Okay. I believe that was my last slide. Stephanie, you want to go to the next one? I think that's, we're getting into the international part. Yep. So, okay, Dave, back to you.
Yeah, and I'm being told that we need to wrap up the Spectrum pipeline.
Okay.
So I'll do this quickly. I mean, you've seen this. If you've been around before, you've seen this slide before, and it hasn't really changed that much in the last 6 months, even 9 months. I think the biggest thing that I would call your attention to is I actually should have updated the slide now that I think about it. So I will do that for the next time. But the block at the very bottom where it talks about the European Commission recommending for study the 3.8 to 4.2 range, that's actually gone a step further now. So I think it was December 16th. Or maybe it just, anyways, in December they had a final draft and then it was just voted on. So the European Commission has now given the CEPT, which essentially is the group responsible for both coming up with the harmonized, coming up with the recommendations for national regulatory authorities, as well as asking for BRAN or ETSI for the harmonized technical rules. The EC commissioned or mandated CEPT to conduct a report on the feasibility of studying 3.8 to 4.2 for, I'm just going to call it local uses, and that could include industrial type applications as well as enterprise type uses. So that was actually a pretty significant step that the EC has now mandated that from CEPT. CEPT has to come back with an interim report by November of this year, and then the final draft I think is due July of 23 is the current schedule. And if they come back saying that they do believe that it's feasible to share this band with low or medium power type local cellular services with the existing incumbent operations, then again they'll work with ETSI to come up with a local a recommendation for local harmonized technical standards. So that is all been approved. It's been in the works for probably 9 months now, but it was finally that mandate was approved and is now in effect as of in the last month, I'll say. So that's probably the most significant thing. The other thing that I was going to mention, it's not on the slide, but it's been pretty widely rumored in the last couple of weeks, that as India comes to a point of wrapping up its 5G auctions, that they're planning to set aside about 25 megahertz from 3400 to 3425 for private use cases. So again, that's a rumor at this point. TRAI has not said anything officially, but it's fairly widely believed that that's what's going to happen. We can argue about whether 25 megahertz, how useful that is, but we could see 25 megahertz in India for private uses. So I think, again, knowing that we're out over time, I'll just say, Andy, Mark, anything you want to quickly add there?
Nope, a lot of work going on.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is, as I was talking to somebody from Gartner last week, and they said, this private wave is only building, and it's really becoming popular, not just in the developed markets, but now really spreading everywhere. So yeah.
That's a good slide.
Okay. Yeah, I think that may be it. So we can turn it back over to you, Alan.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, Dave,
Thank you.
Mark, and Andy, thank you very much. That's this is the kind of content that we really owe our members, and I really appreciate the insights here and the work that you guys do in putting it together. So thank you. We did have a few questions that came in, but with our time, we always seem to underestimate the time we should allocate for these things. So we will let everybody know that we will record the questions. We owe you answers to the questions, so we'll get those to the right folks. And as part of the materials for the meeting, the answers will be uploaded as well, so you can follow up with those and see what happens. So now moving on to the final section of today, and again under that heading of probably we didn't allocate enough time, because there's some really good panelists that I get to introduce now, and I ask them to join me up on quote unquote the stage. So Andy, we're going to bring you back, and folks have had a chance to see you and hear you. Guido Voltolina from Nokia, and I'm going to ask you guys to very briefly introduce yourselves here in just a moment. Masood Olfat from Federated Wireless, Mike Owen from Bearcom, and Prash Ramani from Motorola Solutions. So gentlemen, I'm going to ask you in order, start with Andy, and I just ask you to do a very brief introduction, and then we'll get into the meat of the topics we have today. So Andy, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, nothing's changed in the last hour. Spectrum Engineering Lead at Google, and we are one of the currently approved SaaS administrators.
Very good. Guido?
Morning, everybody. This is Guido Voltolina. I'm with the business development for CBRS commercialization at Nokia, and also the representative at the board of director of the OnGo Association.
Very good.
Welcome,
thanks,
everybody.
Thank you, Guido. Masood.
Hey, good afternoon. Happy New Year to everybody. This is Masood Olfad. I'm the Vice President of Technology and Ecosystem Development for Federated Wireless. And as Google, we are also an approved SaaS administrator and ESC operator. Thank you.
Thanks, Masood. Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Owen. I'm Vice President of Information Technology and Innovation at Bearcom. We're an integrator, so we do a lot of the deployments across the ecosystem right now. So really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And Prash.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Prash Ramani with Motorola Solutions. I'm a senior technical sales lead here at Motorola, cover and manage the entire central US, so overseeing our sales and deployments in this part of the world. So happy to be here.
Very good. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here. You know, what we tried to do, and a little bit of history for everyone, is we used to do what we called the SaaS admin panel, and Masood and Andy in particular would come up and talk to us about how SaaS was progressing, some of the interesting things that were going on. And we realized that this really needed to evolve beyond that story. So the concept of this ecosystem panel, more about end to end. So what we tried to do was think, you know, how do we bring people together to talk about really this whole picture that we're putting together at SaaS, all the way to the real deployments in the field. So in the spirit, however, of our history, maybe I'll start off, Masood, with you and say, you know, what is new in the SaaS world? Even though we may downplay it a little bit now, it is the cornerstone of everything we do. So what's happened maybe in the last 6 months that's interesting from the SaaS admin's perspective?
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, just want to mention that we SaaS admins have decided to, in a monthly basis, provide the statistics of deployment to OnGo Alliance and WinForum to be publicized, and that would be the overall number of CBSDs deployed in the band, not necessarily per SaaS administrator. And currently we are close to 190,000, and I'm going to send a new update to OnGo Alliance and WinForum. So that's number one. And we are so happy that in less than 2 years, amid the COVID, we've been able to deploy close to 190,000. And hopefully with the advent of 5G and COVID going away, we can increase it faster. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of, and I'm sorry about my my cold. In terms of the SaaS development, without really necessarily emphasizing on particular company, I want to say that the SaaS ecosystem, first of all, we have been able to make everything much more robust in terms of the operation and working with customers. In terms of the interaction and exchange among SaaS administrators, we have a very good coordination activities among SaaS administrators. We coordinate with each other very frequently, and I can tell you that the work on coexistence have started among SaaS administrator, and we are hoping that in a reasonable time we can have a very good coexistence algorithm and coordination among SaaS admin in terms of avoiding conflicts. Moreover, we have even though it was suspended for a while due to some activities issues such as COVID and others, we have resumed the activity with the government friends, including the DoD CIO, the NTIA, ITS, FCC, and other branch of government which have any stake in CBRS. We have restarted our activities with government in a kind of a bi-weekly coordination with all government entities called IJWG. And I'm so happy that from all fronts, there is a lot of coordination. There is a lot of positive attitude toward coordination. And we are handling several issues, as Andy and Mark said in the first part of the panel today. We are working on developing the IIC TARDIS tree for the CBRS span, at least for the existing portal-based DPAs. We are close to complete that, and that would be the kind of the pathway for others. And also we are working on other issues, including the hopefully some relaxation for CBRS ecosystem in many different angles, such as the issue of ESC and others. And finally, before I finish the first part, given the time, I want to say that we SaaS admins are also very heavily working toward implementing some advanced features for specifically release 2. For example, the two-dimensional antennas, the issue of the enhanced groups, and many other features in release 2 that we believe that it's going to help the ecosystem. And finally, of course, SaaS admins, we are very much ready, and we have been doing testing and a lot of regarding the deployment of 5G. So we want to make sure that make it clear that 5G deployment, as far as the SaaS ecosystem is concerned, is ready to start, and we have done a lot of tests. So let me suffice here, and then maybe if any detail needed, I'll be happy to go into.
Sure. No, thanks, Masood, for that. So just ask if there's any, follow on. I know, Guido, you guys are coming up as a SaaS admin, or Andy, your experience there. Is there anything you guys would like to add?
I would add only the part related to the evolution of PAL subleasing as well. I think that all the SaaS are really putting a lot of efforts in making that happen as soon as possible, let's say that, within the speed of the FCC on the other side as well. But I would say that the effort is really to have all the building blocks to enable any aspect of not only the deployment, but also the business attached to it with the fastest speed possible. Andy, to you have probably something to add too.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is that the number of grandfathered wireless protection zones, these grandfathered Part 90 operators, continues to go down dramatically. And by this time, just about this time next year, none of those will remain. And so there won't be any 3650 to 3700 megahertz grandfathered Part 90 protection. So if you're impacted by those today, the few that are remaining, hopefully you'll get some significant relief within the next few months.
Good deal. Thanks, Andy. Prash, Mike, as customers or users of a SaaS, anything from your perspective that you've seen over the last 6 months or so that is hopefully making your lives better and easier?
Yeah, I think one of the things, if I could start, is we've been talking a lot about that piece, the auction piece, right? There's all the spectrum that was out there that was auctioned, and there was always an understanding of the secondary market that's going to come to fruition and give our customers an opportunity to potentially, they may have not been aware of the auction when it happened, right? It was still kind of very new. And, we told a lot of our customers that there's an auction coming up, if you're interested, please get involved. But it just wasn't really in the forefront for a lot of our customers, especially during COVID times. They were thinking of a lot of other things. But the secondary marketplace, now that this is more mature, we can go to them and say, hey, look, in your specific area, whether it's enterprise or government or state and local, whoever it is, the customers or education, say, hey, you have an option potentially to go lead some of the spectrum, so you have some minimal control of what you're deploying. So I think that's very exciting. And I know it's taken some time, but once that comes to market, that's going to be a game changer.
Good deal. Mike?
Yeah, sure. You know, I think one of the biggest things is as an integrator and as going through this, and you think about, well, there's RF planning. But one of the things when you're going through an organization, you're doing that RF planning, you have to be engaged with the SAS. You have to utilize their resources to help you do the planning for your network, right? We talked a little bit about whisper zones and quiet zones. We've run into DPAs. We've run into these different areas. But if you'll leverage the SAS, they can help you as you're doing your RF planning to alleviate some of these areas that you can run into contention. So they'll help you plan around the PALs. They'll help you understand what spectrum is truly available for your customers.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Mike, because I know, in my member conversations, I often hear, people feeling a little frustrated and not utilizing all the resources at their disposal, trying to help get them into that right channel. So that's one of the things that we want to do with this panel is give some folks some insight as to how they can be as effective as possible. And your experience is really appreciated in that regard.
And to Mike's point, if I might, I would add, consider the ecosystem building blocks. But for the people involved in CBRS from the beginning, we're discovering that the location of the customer is key to find out what is the best solution for them. Either it's because of density or landscape shape, different aspect that may affect the solution at different levels, so not just at the SAS level, but definitely where it happened. It determines so many other items that being generic is, let's say, I'm not saying it's impossible, but is less suggested than being specific from a location perspective.
Gotcha.
Alan, if you allow me, please, because the issue of PAL listing and secondary market was mentioned.
Sure.
Please allow me to add. So first of all, as Andy said in the first part of the panel as well, we are all ready and we are waiting for FCC to complete the process. We are hoping that in the next couple of weeks, there is some indication that in the next couple of weeks we can go through final test and certification, but it's not confirmed, of course. We have to, when it is done, we have to say it is done. So it's only hope. But one thing I want to add that the leasing and secondary market process in CBRS framework, using that light touch process, it's much more granular than other bands, both in terms of time, as well as frequency, as well as geography, which means that, for example, you can lease a spectrum only for an event, or maybe only a couple of days. So that the process allows you to do that. Also, it allows you to lease within a very high granularity of geographical location. For example, one stadium or one area, as well as the frequency. So just wanted to add that, and moreover, the light touch allows us to finalize the leasing transaction much faster than the conventional Form 608, hopefully within a few minutes. So these are the advantage of the PAL leasing process in CBRS that perhaps it's going to help to make the ecosystem more efficient.
No, very good. Thanks for pointing that out, Masood. Yeah, and the leasing, that secondary market is really one of the most fascinating things, and it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves and changes the way people think about, the spectrum and utilizing it. So I'm curious as to how all that will play out as well. It's going to be a really interesting time for us. So, we've talked a little bit about where we've come from, and some of the things that are happening now. So Prash, maybe I'll put you on the spot and then kind of into Mike as well, so what are we expecting in 2022? What are the things that, from an ecosystem development perspective, are you guys seeing and thinking about as the integrators, as the deployers?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot of in the space is an expansion of what happened a lot in 2020 and 2021, which was application, right? I think educators and, school administrators, superintendents, boards, school, state boards, or even just local school boards are seeing that, this has been a persistent problem in terms of connectivity to students. That was well before the pandemic and was definitely exacerbated during the last couple of years, right? So they want to see more permanent solutions. Many of these districts have, robust IT departments where they can handle, putting up this type of network and managing it, but then also taking advantage of a lot of the things that are managed for them, right? The spectrum is managed for them through all of our, the partnerships with all these SaaS providers, including the ones on this call here. And services can be managed. A lot of it can be taken off their plate because it is fairly plug and play and is very easy to stand up, right? So it's all about what we did in the last couple of years was convincing them that, hey, this is not a Herculean task anymore to stand up these wide area networks. It is something that is very feasible and easy to do. And not to mention that, looking at this year, especially last year and this year, funding through the infrastructure bill, funding through the ARP grants, right? So much of the federal funding that's going to assist these state and local governments is centered around broadband and, trying to help those underserved communities. Now, everyone's going to have a different way of doing it, a different flavor. It's not a one size fits all. I think that's a key, but I think we have, as an ecosystem in the CBRS space, have a very key part in it and can touch and affect a lot of people all over the country. So I think there's going to be a huge, swing or continuation of growth in that space. I think the one other side is also tying to that a little bit is the municipal side, right? So these state and local agencies figuring out new ways to stand up these networks so that they can start this, I like to call the smart city, right? Being able to connect sensors and meters and parking meters and crosswalks and traffic lights, right? It's never been easy to do, but I think we have a great story to make it easier for them to do it, taking some of the management off their plate, but starting to connect more and more so they can be more proactive, whether it's for, security or for just being able to read and be proactive about how much money you're spending on different things and items. I've heard, some really cool use cases of saying, hey, a city says, we have all these lights all throughout our city. We have no idea when they go out unless someone actually sees one that's out and calls in and reports it, right? We have no way to know that. So if we can put a little photo sensor up there and read it, we can then be proactive about changing lights. It's a security thing, but then also just a cost saving. So those are the two things I think going into 2022 is going to be, a huge avenue of growth.
Good deal. Thanks, Prash. Mike, what about your perspective?
Yeah, and along those lines, absolutely right. So education and smart city or the city initiatives, that's have really been the driving force, especially through last year and going into this year, and definitely see continued growth area in that. But what's really starting to come around now and you're starting to hear more about, we're starting to get more inquiries from, we're starting to do more stuff with manufacturing and the whole industry 4.0, where I think we all thought this would be before COVID. That's starting to come alive now, right? We're getting more and more inquiries on that. People want that smart factory floor. They want to be able to do that integration where they need a low latency, high bandwidth network so they can do those things. And then healthcare is the other one that's surprisingly starting more and more to come around. I think in the healthcare, they've realized they have really overutilized Wi-Fi networks within hospitals and within those systems. And they need to offload some of their more, not necessarily the critical care things, but their high demand services that they need to do within that network, whether it's a VoIP phone for a nurse or a nurse's cart that's just providing information and offloading that. So I think where we all thought this would be about a year and a half ago is starting to come alive. Again, now I think that people are becoming more educated about it. But definitely the education space, and we'll see how that it's continued to play forward. We're going to see if it's going to go back into high demand again. But those are kind of the areas that was kind of surprising that it is starting to come back around to more of that tradition. Now we're going to see more of the indoor networks, whereas right now we are still very much in the wide area outdoor networks.
Gotcha. Thanks, Mike. Guido, on building on that, the healthcare one in particular kind of resonated with me. the the issue of network security and information security, and healthcare is a has its own criteria there. But are there particular things we need to be able to address when it comes to network security that are above and beyond?
I mean, luckily enough, the tools and the technology, there are LTE, private LTE deployments, and so on, have all the layers for a degree of security that's way higher than the Wi-Fi days. Let's say that. There is an educational path that need to be done. So of course, if you have a customer or somebody coming from the experience of the phone system, let's say that, they come with an understanding of the security level that are available. If you come from an IT perspective and you start learning about LTE technology, private LTE solution, and so on, you might even not know some of the basic and so even even basic stuff like a handover between a radio and another one. Okay, you can drive a car really fast and the handover can be done even with 4G. You don't even need 5G to do that. And that kind of knowledge is not out there. It's not obvious for many. And so as you have private entities, there's the manufacturing, the educational sector. It really depends on the background of the individual or the organization in order to understand if the basics are in place or not. One thing that I want to mention about 2022 deployment is that we are now going from, are the building blocks available, yes or no? And the answer is yes. But now we're already at one layer up. Is an integrated solution available? And when I say integrated, not just that each part work within each other in a nice way, right? But there's a layer of solution towards either a particular vertical or a particular problem. So I'll just give you an example towards devices, because Motorola is here with us. It's not that you have a device that is CBRS compatible? Yes, it's available. But is device management available within CBRS and the kind of application available? Yes, the answer is yes, it's available. And so now that layer is becoming building up on many verticals and many part of the ecosystem, so that the solution start creating now not just the layer of can I connect and I can go faster and is it stable and from a security perspective, all those aspects. But now I can start, working on multiple use cases or different ways of solving different problems in different situations and so on. And last but not least, of course, 5G. Everybody want to go 5G. I mean, it's not no new news, right? And I think that doesn't matter which vendor you pick, but if you look at their roadmap, through late of last year, beginning of this year, you will see that again, from the radio to the devices to the building blocks, either your need is as a standalone or not standalone. Again, not mentioning any names of any brands or anything, but it is really coming up in fast speed and availability of those solutions.
Andy, I saw you kind of nodding along there. From the perspective of 5G, I know there's a lot of things that resonate there. Is from your guys' perspective, are there challenges there that we still need to overcome to make the ecosystem work, or are we good? Are we in good shape?
The SaaSes can handle 5G now. There's really nothing fundamentally different between 5G and 4G from a SaaS perspective right now. As Masood alluded to, we're working both within OnGo Alliance and in WinForm on advanced features that the SaaS can even better support people. So being able to provide vertical and horizontal antenna patterns will help quite a bit. We've also been discussing the possibility of how we can incorporate dynamic beamforming antennas into SaaS. That's a challenge, but we're smart people, or at least Masood is smart, and maybe we'll find a way to do this. It's not obvious. SaaS doesn't operate on a millisecond by millisecond basis, but we're working on ways to solve this. But Other than that, fundamentally, there's no difference between 5G and 4G or any other technology, and SaaS are able to support them today.
Good deal. So we've got about 5 minutes left, guys. I'm going to put a question to each of you and give you a minute. I would like you to tell me what is the most interesting lesson learned that you can communicate to everyone to help them avoid a pitfall or take advantage of a situation here or take advantage of the technology in the best possible way. So Prash, I'm going to give you a minute. What is your lesson learned that you would like to share with everyone?
Well, I've certainly learned a lot in the last couple of years, but I think number one is really that this is still new to a lot of people, and we have to treat it as such, right? I think all of us in the room are, considered experts. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I think I'm just well versed, maybe, but I think all of us in the room are very knowledgeable on the subject. But when talking to IT administrators, IT directors on a customer, whether it's an enterprise or a municipality or school district, this is still new to them, right? So as much education as we can provide, we have to provide. I think that's kind of the onus is on us, Alliance, to do that, and whatever it takes, right? Because it doesn't happen without heavy touch, heavy education to end users to understand why there's so many benefits to this, right? It's not going to be as inherently obvious as they think. So I would say that's definitely my number one is education and keep evangelizing what we're doing here.
Got it. Thanks, Prash. Mike, what's your lesson learned that you want to communicate to everyone?
Yeah, sure. And I'll go. Education is really, education, expectation, planning, execution, and sustainment. To be really successful with one of these deployments, you have to be end to end. You've got to be able to take a customer all the way from the beginning so that they understand what they're doing or what they're embarking on, all the way through the planning, the execution, the establishment, and then you've got to help them through sustainment. You've got to help them through deployment. You would be surprised that you may get into this situation where you're putting booties on your feet going into people's houses to deploy modems because they just need that level of touch. It is completely new to them as an organization, and it goes beyond what typical, say city or school IT department, they're used to dealing with their computer, their infrastructure. And now they're expanding that into a wide area network. So to be successful, you've got to have an understanding. If you're going into this, you're going to embark on this with the customer. It's end to end. You've got to be able to go. You've got to be able to do zoning and planning. You'd be surprised. You got to put a tower up. That's something typically you don't have to do, right? But the customer's looking for you for that support. So it's really important to be able to provide that end-to-end service to the customer.
Good deal. Thanks, Mike. Guido, how about you? What's your lesson learned?
I would say two aspects. One is as mentioned earlier, who's your customer, and this can go from a small deployment to a large utility that is building a network that is as big as an operator. So of course the range of know-how that you're facing is completely different, and you need to have the tools to address those. And from a pure deployment of CBRS. I would go back to what I mentioned earlier, and it's location drives all the solution is a key aspect. Let's say that it's not the only aspect. It's a very important aspect on building your solution through the ecosystem elements that will be part of the deployment.
Very good. Thanks, Guido. Andy, how about you? What's the lesson you want to communicate to the world?
I would say as early as you can, as you start to plan your CBRS deployment, reach out to your SaaS administrator or a SaaS administrator. And as Guido says, location, location, location is the key here. There are a lot, it's a complex band. I'll admit it. It's a complex band, but once you get it settled and learn, what you can and can't do, you can have potentially free access to prime radio spectrum. So it's worth pursuing. But talk to your SaaS administrator, understand what the limitations may be in your particular area or what the opportunities may be in your particular area, just so you're well versed in what to expect.
Good deal. Thanks, Andy. And Masood, I gave you the first word. I'm going to give you the last word. What's the lesson learned? Oh, you're muted, sir. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. It's very difficult to add to what other friends said, but let me say two important lessons learned. That it was like for example, a hesitancy in the past.
Mm.
Number one is that dynamic spectrum sharing works in reality, in practice. That was a hesitancy in the past. And this deployment showed that it really works. And that's why we see more attention toward the dynamic spectrum sharing in other bands, including 6 gigahertz and potentially in different areas of the world. That's number one. And number two is that inside the United States, really, we industry can work closely with the government. It was a very good example of very close interaction between government and industry, as many of you have mentioned, and we have been witnessing. I believe we need to work on lowering the complexity and also enhancing and allowing more distributed decision making. One of the concerns that added complexity in CBRS was working among the very, very tight coordination required among SaaS admins. We need to work to relax that and allow, as I said, more distributed decision making. You know that the world is moving toward open RAN.
Yeah.
The world is moving toward more distributed deployment, edge. And I can tell you that the CBRS ecosystem is very, very well versed for Open RAN. I have heard some concern that maybe Open RAN might have problem. No, it doesn't.
No.
Actually, we are very much suited to deploy Open RAN, edge-based and more distributed decision making policies in CBRS. So that's my.
Hey, no, thank you very much. I want to thank all the panelists. I'm really looking forward, and there's hope in my heart that in April we'll actually be able to see each other in person, because this kind of conversation that we do, you know, it's very canned and it's compressed in time, so we have to be so efficient. But I'm really looking forward to being able to sit down with all of you and members and having these kinds of conversations that aren't time limited, because these are the things that really really shine. So thank you, gentlemen. Outstanding insights, very much appreciated. And with that, I'll ask you guys to go off cam and I'll start the wrap up. So thank you very much. And with that, we're pretty much at the end of the session. If you did have questions and you got those into the question for us, we will take action on those. We'll make sure to get you answers on those questions. Apologies that we didn't have time to do them in live, but a lot of good content. And like I said earlier, we always seem to underestimate the kinds of things that we would like to talk about. With that, I will go ahead and close down the session today with my thanks. If you do have any other questions, any other information that you need, please contact our admin team. They'll be happy to help you. Again, these slides, this recording, and answers to questions that were submitted will be available on the Causeway platform in about a week. It takes us a little bit of time to put all that together, but it will be available for you to share with colleagues and to review yourselves. With that, I would also say thank you to everyone who's participated today, and ask you to stay safe, stay well, and with some hope that in April we'll be able to do this in person, and that will be a wonderful thing. And with that, enjoy the rest of your Monday, and we will go ahead and end the session now. Thank you.